All right, the 2016 NFL season has begun, and the Cincinnati Bengals are 1-0. They got a hard-fought win in New York against the Jets. We'll talk more about that during the show. I'm joined by my co-hosts Scott Schultze and Connor Howe. But the Bengals also take on a very formidable 1-0 team in the Pittsburgh Steelers, and we have a special guest with us, Chris Bradford, who is the Steelers beat writer of the Beaver County Times. Chris, how are you?
Good, thanks for having me.
Yeah, appreciate you joining me, and I enjoyed being on your show this week too, so I appreciate you reciprocating and coming on here. We've got a lot of questions for you, and it's kind of peeling back the steel curtain and getting a peek behind the scenes there. So I'm just going to jump right into it. Your overall impressions of how the Steelers looked on Monday night against a Redskins team that went to the playoffs, and obviously the Steelers, like the Bengals, are missing some of their key guys due to suspensions and whatnot. So your overall impressions of how the Steelers looked on Monday night against the Redskins?
Well, I think on the offensive side of the ball, I think it was pretty much what the Steelers expected. I think anytime you have Antonio Brown and Ben Roethlisberger, you know what they're capable of doing. No great surprises there. The only question mark coming in with those guys was that they hadn't got a lot of time together in the preseason. Mike Tomlin had held those guys out, his first-team offense, from playing much. Obviously, no rust there. Those guys have been together for a long time, so they have a chemistry. The defensive side of the ball, the Steelers didn't get the pass rush that they were looking for, but it was kind of similar to what we've seen from them in past years, where it's a bend but don't break defense. They can give up a lot of yards. They gave up 320-some yards to Kirk Cousins, but they also only gave up 16 points, the one touchdown coming in the fourth quarter when the game was pretty much decided at that point. It was overall, I think, a very good effort from the Steelers. I think that was they'll certainly take a performance like that.
Again, talking to Chris Bradford of the Beaver County Times, Steelers beat writer. I'm going to ask about a player who is kind of a villain in the fans' eyes for Cincinnati, and also kind of is a little bit near and dear to their hearts in James Harrison, because he played for them for a year. The ageless wonder, James Harrison. Are the Steelers banking on him still having an impact in his, I guess he's now, in his mid-30s. So are they still banking on him having a pretty big impact this year?
Yeah, James Harrison is 38 years old. And he is a kind of a physical freak. You know, the workout stuff he posts on social media, you see him, getting himself into shape. I think the plan was to kind of scale him back a little bit this year. He played, I believe, 55% of the defensive snaps last year. Before the season, they were talking about 25 snaps per game, not percent. So he kind of played his way into a bigger role. This year, they're hoping to scale him back a little bit, but an injury to Bud Dupree, the first-round pick in training camp, he's now on IR, so that's kind of pushed James Harrison, giving him a bigger role than I think the Steelers would have liked to. But, when he's still performing at a high level, and if this is his last season, and he has hinted that this might be it, I think the Steelers are willing to, kind of run the wheels off of him and see what happens.
On the offensive side of the ball, we obviously all know that Antonio Brown is, that kind of guy where teams are going to game plan and try to shut him down as much as they can. I think the Bengals have done a pretty good job over the past couple of years of trying to limit Antonio Brown as much as they could. And in the process, they really surrendered a lot of yards to Martavis Bryant. Do you think that the fact that Bryant is out now, obviously on one side, and I'm guessing it's going to be Wheaton and then Rodgers in the slot as well, do you think that the Bengals capable of shutting down Brown? And I mean, I'd love to hear your argument for why they couldn't or why they would be able to. And if they can, do you think that D'Angelo Williams / the other receivers behind Antonio Brown can do enough to pick up the slack on that end?
A good question. I think with Antonio Brown, you saw last week the Redskins were supposed to obviously have that big showdown with Josh Norman. It never really materialized because they never really put Norman on Antonio Brown much. But it seems like no matter who has gone up against him, whether it was Chris Harris Jr. last year in Denver, Antonio Brown just finds ways to beat people. He accepts a challenge if it's a top cornerback or a double team. He usually can beat people. The question for the Steelers is, with Martavis Bryant not in there, who has to step up and take their place? Marcus Wheaton did not play last week. He did not practice again today. He looks like might be questionable again for week 2. Eli Rogers is really the name to look after, because he might be the best slot receiver I think that Ben Roethlisberger has had. He's really been impressive in the preseason and in training camp. And the other guy was Sammy Coates, who the Steelers drafted last year in the 3rd round. He was kind of an insurance policy against Martavis Bryant. Eventually what happened with the failed drug test, the Steelers were looking to him to kind of provide some of the same qualities that Martavis Bryant provides in terms of speed and size. And, he's got a high ceiling. The Steelers are still very high on him. And I expect both Rodgers and Coates really to be the 2 guys who are going to pick up the slack, especially without Ladarius Green not available, at least for the first 6 weeks at least.
Chris, there's a question, I guess, going to the other side of the ball, to the defense. Back during the draft, there was a story that we just couldn't seem to get away from, which was when the Bengals made their selection, no one's expecting defensive back. They grab William Jackson III, and then the Steelers respond and take Artie Burns. The big thing that came out in a lot of the media was the Steelers really loved William Jackson. They kind of reached for Artie, and then they kind of fed that story because the next pick they got another defensive back, and then recently traded for Justin Gilbert. So someone who's a lot closer to the team than we are. Is there any truth to that? Did they really, really want Jackson, and do they feel like they reached for Artie? Do they really like Artie Burns? What's going on there?
Well, I think they really do like Artie Burns, but I do know that William Jackson III was going to be their pick had the Bengals not moved in there. Actually, during that entire draft, you could see kind of the competition between the Steelers and Bengals, because I know a lot of people in Pittsburgh were thinking they were going to take Andrew Billings possibly in the 1st round, and he ends up going to Cincinnati. And then Tyler Boyd, the kid here who went to Pittsburgh, a lot of people wanted the Steelers to take him as well, and it ends up they all go to Cincinnati. Unfortunately for the Bengals, they've had some bad luck with injuries with some of those guys, but I don't think that necessarily takes away from what the Steelers have in Artie Burns. He's been battling a quad injury through training camp. He's just only in the last week or two really starting to show signs of why he was the 1st round pick. Before the injury, he was going up against Antonio Brown in training camp a lot in Latrobe. And, that's kind of a losing battle for most any cornerback, certainly a rookie just coming in off, out of Miami. So, I think the Steelers are still high on Artie Burns, and I think, he's probably not going to get A.J. Green this week, but, I think maybe next year, looking down the road, I think the Steelers like the progress he's been making so far.
And that leads me to a second question. You talked about the Bengals injuries. I know the Steelers have definitely had some in the secondary. Gilbert, who I just mentioned, he, I guess, missed with the concussion. Golson's out for quite a while. Burns missed. I don't think he played the first week. The big narrative all preseason was the offense is going to be huge. We saw that in the first week, that 38-16, just how they destroyed the Redskins. Is the defense going to hold up their end of the bargain and really match what everyone expects from that offense?
Yeah, that's really the question mark for the Steelers, and has been really for the past few years. I think the Steelers like what they have in the front 7. They've invested a lot of recent draft picks at the linebacker position. It hasn't always panned out as well as they would like, and certainly with Jarvis Jones, they didn't pick up a 5th-year option on him. Bud Dupree now is out for half a season. They still got Ryan Shazier, who I think is really going to be a blossoming star. But the real question mark is in that secondary, and that's been the weakest link on that defense. The Steelers have tried in the past 2 years in the draft to kind of bolster that position, kind of mimicking kind of what the Bengals did in trying to get some players with better pedigree. And it really just hasn't panned out for him so far. You mentioned Senquez Golson. He was penciled in to be the slot corner. He missed his entire rookie season. Now he looks like he's going to miss most of his 2nd season. Burns has been hampered by injury. And then Dorian Grant, kid from Ohio State, he was taken in the 4th round. He's already gone. I mean, he got released this year, and I think he just got actually released from, I believe it was Buffalo's practice squad already. So the problem with the Steelers has been in identifying and developing defensive backs. And if they can, turn that around, and hopefully Artie Burns and Senquez Golson, when he is healthy, I think the Steelers, will finally be on the right track in terms of the secondary.
Okay, thanks. There's one last question. I can't walk away without asking this one, since we are a Bengals Steelers discussion right here. There's been a lot of talk, especially with the way the playoff game went and how the last few years have gone with the two teams. Do the Steelers view the Bengals? They've kind of come out and said, no, the Ravens are our rival. We really don't think about Cincinnati. Is there any truth to that, especially since the two teams have really seemed to be battling for the the division the last few years, and I think the Bengals won it last year, and I think the year before. So, is that just some stoking the fire, or is that kind of how they feel?
Yeah, it's funny. Today that was a big talk around the locker room. Who is the Steelers' biggest rival? And kind of the Cleveland Browns have always traditionally, maybe that's been like your father or grandfather's rival, and then maybe your older brother or uncle was the Baltimore Ravens. But I think in the past 2 years, it is the Cincinnati Bengals. And I don't care what any of the players were saying today. It's the Bengals that really stokes the fire. Maybe the rivalry is different maybe than it was for the Ravens. I think because of the injuries, I think there was kind of a nastiness and a lack of respect in this rivalry that wasn't there, I think, for the Ravens a few years ago. Because 10 years ago, I think the Steelers-Ravens rivalry was probably as good as any in football, and I think now it's maybe the Steelers and Bengals. I think easily they're the two best teams in the AFC North, and the Bengals haven't had postseason success, and I think the Steelers kind of rub it in that the Bengals have never won a Super Bowl or a playoff game in some time now, and I think when they say it's not the rival, I think that's just kind of poking them a little bit.
Talking with Chris Bradford, Steelers beat writer with the Beaver County Times. Chris, I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to turn the tables on you a little bit, and I'm going to ask you a question you asked me on your show. Obviously, there's a lot of animosity between the players in this rivalry. The fan base is very chippy with each other, and they do not like each other's team's players. You had asked me some of the Bengals fans' most hated Steelers players. What do you see the Steelers fan base? I mean, I think the answers are pretty obvious, at least with Vontaze Burfict. But aside from him, who are some of the kind of the public enemies of the Bengals in the eyes of Steeler fans?
Well, I think you can't go wrong with Pac-Man Jones. I think he's next to Burfict, who's clearly public enemy number one. I think it's Pac-Man Jones. We saw some of the social media posts that he was doing after the two games, including the playoff games. He's a guy, going back to his days in Dallas and stops elsewhere. He's never really had a very good reputation, and certainly with West Virginia University not being far down the road, a lot of people know a little bit more about Adam Jones or Pac-Man. So he's not going to rank very high with Steelers fans. I think those two really are the only two that really stand out. I mean, like Geno Atkins, I think people have a ton of respect for. And, I think Andy Dalton has kind of moved into the upper echelon of quarterbacks where, he's, certainly capable, I think, of delivering a playoff win. And, you have to respect a guy like A.J. Green as well. So I think really it just centers around Vontaze Burfict, who, I think he's probably replaced Ray Lewis, as probably the all-time villain maybe here in Pittsburgh.
So aside from – I'm going to ask you kind of a two-pronged question here. Aside from all the stuff that's going on behind the scenes, but do you see this – number one, do you see this game being kind of still that chippy nature? Do you think the Bengals learned their lesson from the wild card game? Do you think the Steelers will try and goad them? And how do you see the score playing out this Sunday?
I think it's going to be a high-scoring game. I think, some of the stuff we saw in the last time, I think the suspensions, when you start suspending people, I think that gets people's attention. So I don't expect this to see, pregame brawls or anything, hair-pulling on the sidelines and some of the nonsense that went on last time. I expect, these to be the two best teams in the AFC North, and it should show in the game Sunday. And I think it'll be a fairly high-scoring game. I think both teams' offenses are capable of putting up points. I think the Steelers will probably get 30 again, and I won't be surprised if Cincinnati's right up there with them. I think it's going to be a close game, probably decided within 3 points.
Chris Bradford with the Beaver County Times Steelers beat writer. Before you get out of here, Chris, where can Bengals fans check out some of your work, at least this week, and obviously when the rematch occurs later in the year, your podcast, your work as beat writer, and all of that good stuff?
Sure. Our website is at timesonline.com, and you can find all the stories and the podcasts are on there on the links, and on Twitter at BCT Bradford.
All right. And aside from having your stint on our show on Cincy Jungle's website, we will have my appearance on your show, and we'll promote that too, Chris. I appreciate you coming on tonight.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks. Again, that was Chris Bradford with the Beaver County Times Steelers beat writer. Very kind of him to join us. Excited about this game, and obviously a lot to talk about with this game here. So let's transition. Let's kind of backpedal a little bit if you will. And Scott, I'll start with you. Let's kind of talk about the game against the Jets. And it was a very hard fought win for the Bengals. There were a lot of problems, but there were a lot of good things that happened in this game as well for the Bengals. So the Bengals came out on top 23-22. Interestingly enough, at least from my perspective, a lot of the guys who helped the Bengals come out with a win are guys that have been whipping boys for the Bengals for a number of years. Mike Nugent, Margus Hunt, all of those guys. That's one of the things that kind of stood out to me. But kind of give me your overall impressions. And are you worried about some of the trouble spots we saw, pass protection, not really being able to run the ball, or is that a product of, hey, they went up against a really stout Jets defense?
Well, I think as far as the problems or things we saw that might have been an issue, I think you definitely nailed a couple of them. One of the guys we've been kind of hammering on the Cincy Jungle site and on the podcast is Russell Bodine. My goodness, I know not all 7 sacks were his, but when you watch the high or the low lights of the sacks that were his, they are just brutal. I mean, there's just no protection, just kind of gets thrown around. I was, really kind of hoping, this might be the, year 3. We're going to kind of see him going through, or maybe getting a little better, maybe becoming league average. But yeah, granted, it was a good defensive line, but still, that was pretty brutal. And then only getting I think the Bernard and Hill only got 56 yards on 14 attempts, and they were just struggling to run the ball. They didn't run it very much, but that kind of leads you to the positives, which were, throwing the ball. And you figure the 7 sacks, and Andy Dalton still 23 for 30 for like 360 yards or something, which pretty impressive. I mean, when he first couple years in the league, that was always one of the big knocks on him, was when he got pressure, he collapsed. As soon as he got pressure, he'd collapse. He'd kind of just throw it up, or he'd just kind of crumple up and wait for the sack to hit. And he kind of stayed in there despite the constant pressure. He got a ton of yards, especially against some good defensive players. Revis, I'd say overall, I think the positives were better than the negatives, because, the only real negative I saw was Bodine, which I think is a massive negative, but that and the fact that they gave up a ton of yardage. They kind of they stopped them kind of when it mattered, but yeah, that's just a lot of yardage to give up. It's kind of getting gashed by folks like Matt Forte, and you just really figure. Yeah, and at his age, a lot of talk was, well, they're going to committee him or platoon him, and he's getting up there, and yeah, granted, it wasn't like he was running for 200 yards, but yeah, I just thought that, I don't know, that I was kind of hoping for a little more up front, especially with the talk last week of the Jets kind of replacing half their line, that we'd get a little more pressure. And I know they were trying to scheme against that with the really quick throws, getting them out of Fitzpatrick's hands, trying to keep, and they didn't really throw anything deep. And I think we kind of saw that with Marshall and Decker. They caught like 5 of 15 targets for 69 yards. They really weren't getting too much deep on us, but still, even if they're game planning for it, you would think at some point, we'd have to get a little pressure, a little. Overall, I'd say I was very happy with the game, especially since we won.
Connor, I don't think I've, at least in recent memory, I don't think I've been simultaneously as frustrated and as happy with the Bengals' performance on Sunday against the Jets. They had struggles on offense. Andy Dalton was hit a bunch of times. Aside from your overall, I do want to hear your overall observations and takeaways from the game, but I specifically remember last week when you talked to our guest from Gangrene Nation that you asked him about Darrelle Revis. And Connor, what do you think about A.J. Green's performance against Darrelle Revis, a guy who was known as an elite cornerback? Obviously, he's getting older, but can still play at a high level. Give me some observations as well as the A.J. Green-Darrelle Revis matchup, since that's what you touched on last week.
Yeah, I think we all saw, and I don't want to kind of, say I called it or anything, because I don't really think I was bold enough to say that Green would have done half as much as what he did on Sunday. But, man, oh man, can you not understate how well he played last week? He made Revis look like a bad player, and Revis had a good game. Revis was all over him on virtually every single play that Green had. But despite that, Green still came out with, I believe against Revis, 150-plus yards. I think he had 180 on the day with a touchdown. The dude was just unbelievable. And obviously the whole narrative and the storyline the media is going to come up with, and we're already seeing it on Pro Football Focus and other places like that, is, is Revis over the hill? Is he on the decline? I think the New York Post also talked about that. But I think respect is due where respect is earned. And A.J. Green had the best game of week 1, hands down. I didn't write it this week, and I should have. I don't care that Antonio Brown torched Washington. A.J. Green had the best week of anyone this year, or anyone this week. Revis is still better than Norman and Breeland. I don't care who Antonio Brown beat. A.J. Green had the best week of anyone in the NFL. And I just think that this is his year, man. I think this is the year that if Green can stay healthy and he's the primary target of this offense, there really is no stopping him. And people are going to talk about, he's been a top 5 receiver his entire career. He can do better. I mean, we haven't seen anyone since 2012 perform the way Calvin Johnson did. But Calvin Johnson was consensus, hands down, best receiver in the NFL, even with Green and Julio Jones and Antonio Brown and all these guys in the league. The guys in the league haven't changed except Calvin Johnson's been gone. But, man, A.J. Green really has a chance. He could be the number 1 in the league. I have no doubt in my mind, and I'm hoping that it's going to happen this year.
Yeah, A.J. Green, the storyline of obviously the afternoon was A.J. Green, as well as Andy Dalton really rebounding from and it was due to the pressure, but Andy Dalton at the beginning, you could tell, was a guy who missed the last handful of games in 2015. He was making a lot of poor throws, some of the bad Andy, quote unquote, that we've seen in his first couple of years. And a lot of throws off his back foot. You saw the interception he threw, which was just a very poor decision. But as the game wore on, he did a lot better. And the thing that impressed me, aside from A.J. Green, and it was a pleasant surprise, we talked about Margus Hunt having the blocked field goal, a tackle for loss, and doing some nice things. We talked about some of these other guys stepping up. And Scott, I know you want to talk about one particular player who played well throughout most of the game, and particularly at the end of the game. We'll get to that in a second. But one guy I was really impressed with was Brandon LaFell. And he finished with 4 catches for 91 yards. A 49-yard catch he had on a deep ball down the sideline was one on 3rd and 18 when the team was in dire straits, and he made a very, very big play. And we really didn't know what to expect from Brandon LaFell, both from the aspect of his poor year with the Patriots last year, as well as him not really playing much this preseason with the Bengals. So I was really impressed with Brandon LaFell as a supplemental weapon. Obviously, A.J. Green is the storyline, rightfully so. But, Bengals fans have to be happy with what they saw from Brandon LaFell. A lot of guys stepped up to help get the Bengals that hard-fought 23-22 win. Scott, I'm going to kick it over to you real quick. You wanted to mention one other player that ended up playing well as a guy who stepped up for someone else that was injured.
Yeah, this is one that I was just chatting with my wife over on the side, and we were talking about what to make sure to discuss for the game. And she said that I need to make sure to mention the interception to end the game by Josh Shaw. And I thought it was a heck of a catch. And then also you figure, like you mentioned, he's covering for guys who are injured. William Jackson's injured. Denard's out. And so you're looking, beginning of the year, that was kind of one of the strengths and we lost some other guys recently. We lost Newman when he went up to Minnesota. So you're getting a little thinner. Adam Jones is getting older. So a lot of the thought was, okay, going into this year, especially when William Jackson gets hurt, because a lot of people were looking at him as possibly even starting this year. And with him out and Denard out, you really need those guys like Deron Smith and Josh Shaw and, Lewis Harris to really step up. And so to see him step up and do that, to get that pick to win the game, I thought was pretty awesome.
Yep. And those who know me, being a Southern California guy, I've been a fan of Josh Shaw, both from what I saw from him at USC. I will say that interception, while a good play, was a bit lucky. He kind of turned his head and that ball was right in his numbers. But overall, hey, the Bengals are 1-0. It was a tough game. We knew it was going to be tough. We all predicted it to be pretty close. And, that's what it ended up being. And likely, as Chris Bradford, our guest earlier, said, this week is probably going to be the same. And we'll talk more about that game in just a little bit. Last week, we started a new segment, and it's the brainchild of Connor Howe, and it's a fun little game. Perhaps you can make a game of it on Sunday of your own, maybe a little adult beverage type of game. But Connor Howe came up with some over and unders, and obviously I didn't really tally exactly how we did last week, but some of those numbers based on AJ Green and Dalton and all that stuff, we were kind of all over the board here. Connor, you've got a few more for us this week against the Steelers, and along with many of these other division games the Bengals have on their schedule every year, one thing we can expect with the Bengals against the Steelers is to expect the unexpected. So you've got some numbers, and you want to start off with Andy Dalton and some numbers there.
Yeah, and before I get to Andy Dalton, man, I just have to say it's hunting season, baby. I mean, Marcus Hunt, we didn't give him enough credit, man. I think he just had such a good game, and I'm so happy for him. And, he had a blocked field goal.
It was good to see.
Blocked field goal. I'm pretty sure he deflected the extra point, too. I'm not 100% sure, but I think Pro Football Focus mentioned that. I need to go back and watch it. But he hit Ryan Fitzpatrick's arm as well on a play that should have really been a pick if the ball didn't spin weird. Sean Williams should have come down with that one. And he looked good creating pressure. I think fans are really excited about the blocked field goal, but I really think that Hunt's performance, I know, wouldn't have been as celebrated if it wasn't for that huge block. But I really think that it was the defense way more so than the special teams, and the special teams saved 4 points, I believe. But I think the defense was really what fans needed to see out of Hunt. Is he's a guy who, like we were saying a couple weeks ago, he's just one of those guys who really he earned his shot and he got it, and I'm happy for him. I hope he plays well. But that being said, let's get into the over-unders. I think AC, as you mentioned last week, it was kind of it was a weird week to track. It was the first time we did the segment. I was looking back today and I didn't track who did well, who didn't do well. I'm assuming Scott did pretty well, but I know Scott didn't get all of them right because he bet the under on every single one. So we're going to go over on this week now, starting with Andy Dalton, 250 yards. I'll go first this time, and we'll try to mix up the order a little bit. Dalton, I set for 250 yards. Last week he had over 300, but he's playing the Steelers, and the Steelers have one of those secondaries where they're pretty aggressive. They're certainly going to be trying to be aggressive against Cincinnati this week, as we saw last week. The Jets were really aggressive with their three-man front. They brought all kinds of stunts and blitzes that confused the offensive line. But that being said, I think Dalton's going to go over 250. I think he could probably go over 300 this week as well. With AJ Green, a guy who's dominated the Pittsburgh Steelers that secondary in the past. Scott, what do you think?
I'm going to say for Dalton, I'm going over. So last week, as you mentioned, I was the under guy. This week, I think I might become the over guy. Because looking at Dalton, he's kind of gotten pretty close. He was last 4 games, he was at 300 against the Steelers, like 244, 230. And then that one game, he was like 59 in like one drive. So he's kind of right there. I think he's definitely improving as a passer. So I'm kind of saying it, especially as Chris was saying, that secondary isn't exactly. So, yeah, this week won't be positive. We won. So I'm going to say over.
This one's tough for me because I look at it and I go, will the Bengals be behind and they're forced to pass the ball a lot? Will the running game struggle like it did last week, and they'll be forced to rely on Andy Dalton and AJ Green quite a bit? Will the Steelers' pass defense, step up and really hold Andy Dalton in check based on what we saw last week? I think he's definitely capable of getting more than 250 yards based on a variety of circumstances. I'm going to say under, though, and maybe just by barely, maybe 240 yards, 230, based on a variety of factors. So I'm going to say under, but just barely.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, for as we were talking about the running backs earlier, and as Scott obviously mentioned, Bodine looked really bad. I think also it's worth mentioning the whole entire line struggled. I mean, Whitworth gave up an early penalty, it's very rare for Whitworth to do anything that's less than perfect. He really struggled. And Zeitler and Bowling, for as good as they are, man, they didn't look good on Sunday. I mean, I think credit needs to be given to Todd Bowles. I think fans are really underestimating what he brought to the table as a defensive mastermind. He's a guy that turned the Cardinals, who are a perennial average or worse team, into one of the best teams in the NFL in terms of their defense. He blitzed like at a historical rate in Arizona, and they still had one of the best coverage units in the entire NFL. He's just one of those guys where I think he is such an impactful coach, and he has so much wisdom that his fronts, he had two guys, but he had two guys at the end of the day. He really didn't do that much that in terms of, he didn't have the personnel, but they really overwhelmed the Bengals line, and they just looked lost. And I don't know. I think Keith Butler, the Steelers defensive coordinator, is going to try to take advantage of that, and maybe the Bengals try to run, because as played, those two shotgun runs aside, I believe the Bengals still average about 5 yards per carry with Hill and Bernard. So who knows? But on to the next guy, and we'll go Hill and Bernard here. Jeremy Hill and Giovanni Bernard last week, I think they combined for 61 total yards on the entire game. And it wasn't out of struggle, I don't think, as much as it was, like I said, the Bengals just really didn't need to run the ball, and they didn't need to even pass it to Gio Bernard. They were just throwing those screens to AJ Green, and he was just taking it down the field. So I'll start with you, Scott. Giovanni Bernard and Jeremy Hill, over and under 100 total rushing yards only.
I'm going to say just under, even though I said I was going to be the over guy this week, just because historically, I know as good as they do, Pittsburgh is one team they just struggle to run against. I think Hill, only once in his career, maybe Bernard I think Bernard's never top 40 against him. I think Hill's only had one game where he got above like 50 or 60. They just, for whatever reason, they seem to struggle against them. It tends to be a game where they can't establish the run early, and then they tend to throw a lot, which is why I think we see a lot of yards from Hill or from Green and Dalton in these games. So I'd love to see him, just bust it loose, get 100, 150 yards. But the, I guess, more pragmatic side of me says that they're probably going to be just under the 100.
Yeah, I think if those guys combine for 100 yards, I think Cincinnati has a really good shot to win. I think that means that they're doing pretty well, especially if the carries are split pretty even. I think I'm going to go under on this one for the same reason Scott said. But if the Bengals and Gio Bernard and Jeremy Hill are able to crack that 100-yard mark, I think they have a very good shot to win. But overall, I'm going to say under.
Yeah, I should have probably said it a little lower or changed it to rushing and receiving. But like you guys mentioned, it's
a fair number, I think. I mean, it's a fair number, especially split between two backs. But like I said, I just think if they're able to do that, that's going to be impressive against the Steelers defense. And
like we all saw, I mean, the Bengals really didn't need to run against New York, and Pittsburgh doesn't have that great of a secondary. Who knows? Maybe they get ahead and they just keep throwing it. Maybe they're behind and they throw it. But yeah, it's one of those things where it's really hard to just – you want to see one of those Jeremy Hill breakout games, but if the Bengals can win and not run a single time, I'll take the win, So it's one of those things. I think that we'll have to wait until the Bengals face, another team. Maybe with now that Malik Jackson's gone and they were a little weak against the Panthers. Maybe that's the game that Jeremy Hill, and I remember Jeremy Hill took off on a really long run against the Panthers last time they played. But on to the next one. We've got AJ Green, and after a huge game with 100 and whatever yards, pretty sure it was like a 180 and a touchdown, we're going to go 115 as the over-under mark for AJ Green. And just so you guys know, last year I believe he went from 118 in one game, 134 in the other game. I believe in the playoffs he went for 79 or something. Those aren't exact numbers, but I'm pretty sure those are very close to what the actual numbers were. So 115 for AJ. We'll start with AC. What do you got, man?
Well, just as a side note, and this is no disrespect to Chad Johnson, did a lot of good things for the Bengals over the years. One thing that really stands out about AJ Green over Chad Johnson in his time in Cincinnati, to me, is his performance against the Steelers. And Chad Johnson had some good games against the Browns and the Ravens, but he disappeared against the Steelers, whereas AJ Green has really, really had some good games against the Steelers. So I'm gonna say over on this one. I think Dalton's gonna look his way a lot. Green has had his way with the Steelers of late, as you mentioned, Connor. And the Steelers defense, while they're stout in that front seven, they are a tiny bit suspect on that back end in the secondary. So I'm going to say over.
And I'm going
to. How about you, Scott?
I guess at the beginning I said I was going to be the over guy, and I'm going to join with Anthony on that one. I'm going to say over also. He just, as Anthony kind of alluded to, he kind of has had his way with the Steelers of late, and I think part of that is probably that the secondaries kind of struggled. Last year, you mentioned he had the 2 games for 118 and 132 in the regular season. In 2014, he had like over 300 yards of receiving against them. I think he had 224 in a game. So, yeah, he just seems to have their way with everyone in the AFC North except the Browns. And I don't know what it is with the Browns, but when it's the Steelers or Ravens, he just seems to explode. So I'm going to say over 115.
Yeah, I'll take the over here too. I mean, we saw it in week 1. You try to stop AJ, a lot easier said than done. You put a future Hall of Fame corner on him and give him help, and Green's still going to beat you. So I'm taking the over until Green doesn't, put up a big numbers in one game. So next in line, we've got Carlos Dunlap and Geno Atkins. They had a pretty quiet game in week 1. I believe the whole defensive line had a pretty quiet game. As we mentioned, Matt Forte looked pretty good. And we saw D'Angelo Williams ran for 143 against Washington with 2 touchdowns. Granted, that's probably because the Redskins have a pretty inept defensive line with, I don't even know who their nose tackle is now, but Terrence Knighton's gone, and that looks like a really bad move in retrospect. So, Geno Atkins, Carlos Dunlap combined for 1.5 sacks. Are you going to take 2 or more? Are you going to take 1 or less? We'll hit you first, Scott.
I am just going to be Mr. Optimistic and say over. Every time Geno Atkins sacks Roethlisberger, I think it brings a little smile to a lot of Bengals fans' faces. And especially that one several years ago when he just plowed over David DeCastro. And every time I see the Bengals Steelers and think of Atkins, I can't help but picture him getting a sack. So I've got a picture. He's good for 1. I think in his career he averages just under a sack a game. Somewhere against them. So I'm going to say, sack for him. Dunlap, I think in his last 2 games against the Steelers, now that he's kind of coming into his own, he had half a sack in the playoff game and then a full sack in the last regular season game. So I'd say I could see between the 2 of them, 1.5 sacks. I'll take the over and say 2 because I really want him to do it. And I think it kind of makes up for last week for having kind of a down week defensively. I think they're probably pushed really hard by the defensive coaches, and they come out and they nail. I'm hoping Roethlisberger at least a couple times. So I'm going to say over.
I agree. I think it's going to be just a little over. Last week they only had 1 sack, and it was Geno Atkins that had it. And kudos to the Jets because they created a game plan to get the ball out very quickly and negate the pass rush. And, that's something that the Steelers will probably look at this week too. But the Bengals defensive line tends to play pretty well against the Steelers for the most part. And one thing that both plays against the Bengals defense and plays into the defensive line's hands is Roethlisberger's penchant for running around and kind of trying to play a little backyard football. And sometimes it makes an incredible play for the Steelers. Other times it gets him in big trouble and he gets hit and sacked a lot. So I'll say over, but I don't think that's going to be like a 5 or 6 sack day from the Bengals. I'm thinking maybe 2 or 3 with those 2 probably having 2.
I got to take the over as well. You got to be optimistic. And it's interesting because Carlos Dunlap, he's one of those guys where he's kind of just a hit or miss player in the sense that he'll have one of those huge games. Last year he had 3 sacks against the Broncos with Michael Schofield, who was a pretty bad right tackle. And then he'd play against a good tackle and have a bad game, or he'd play against a bad tackle and have a bad game. It's just one of those things where he's a great player and he's always going to make an impact whether he gets the sacks or not. But his sack numbers are pretty they fluctuate a lot. But that being said, it's also interesting that he faces every year against the Steelers. Every time they play, he faces his former college teammate, right tackle Marcus Gilbert. And Gilbert was a guy where I read it somewhere, but I'm not sure. Don't quote me on this, but I'm pretty sure he only gave up 1 sack all of last year, and it was against Dunlap. So that was pretty interesting when I read that. And Dunlap is a guy where I think he's going to be a pretty big a big part of either the team's success or failure against Pittsburgh. Michael Johnson really needs to show up against Alejandro Villanueva, their left tackle, who was, if you guys remember, he was kind of the guy who I think was in the Army or some sort of armed services, and he's the 6'8" dude who, great feel-good story, struggled early on, but looks pretty decent as things kind of settled down. That being said, you gotta rely on your top two guys on the defensive line to get the job done. Michael Johnson looked great in the preseason. I would love Johnson to sack Roethlisberger 5 times. I'm 100% wrong. You got to depend on Geno and Carlos Dunlap. And like you guys mentioned, Geno's played really well against Pittsburgh, and it's always nice to see Roethlisberger get taken down by the big guy inside. So we've got one last – we'll combine the last two into one because it has to do with the Steelers players. So we'll go Antonio Brown and DeAngelo Williams, 100 yards each. DeAngelo Williams, 100 yards rushing. Antonio Brown, 100 yards receiving. I'll leave it to you, Scott. What do you think?
I'm going to say under. I know I said I was going to be over this week, but only for the Bengals. I think Brown – actually, I think they both probably get close. If you look at what Brown's done against the Bengals, I think last year in the regular season games, he had 87 and 47. I know they had a big playoff game, and I think a couple years ago he was over 100 each year. But before that, they've done a pretty good job in his career keeping him under 100. So I think he stays under 100. As far as DeAngelo Williams, the last couple years, the Steelers have done a pretty good job of gouging the Bengals as far as running the ball, but they tend to do it with two backs. So I'd say if you combined Williams and the top backup, maybe two, because I know when it was Bell and Williams, or even last year in the playoff game when it was Toussaint and whoever the other just two people out of nowhere got him pretty good. So I'm gonna say
I think it was Jordan Todman was the other guy, the guy who's the journeyman.
And I think they rushing and receiving, I think the two of them got like 180 or some ridiculous number against them. So I'm going to say Brown and Williams probably get close, but I'm going to say they probably both get held just under 100, maybe 80 or 90 each.
I'm going to say under for Brown and over for DeAngelo Williams. I think Brown will be relatively held in check. He might find the end zone. That game he had 47 yards. He did have an initial touchdown, which I think was the only touchdown the Steelers scored in that game, and the Bengals won that game, not coincidentally because he had 47 receiving yards. I think Dre Kirkpatrick was on him for a good chunk of that game. Kirkpatrick has had his ups and downs. He had a couple of nice plays last week, but and a couple in the preseason, so he looks to be growing into his role as a starting corner. One thing I like is Dre's length against Antonio Brown's height. Brown isn't the tallest guy. He's got great route running skills, great hands and speed, but Dre's got that length and those long arms, and he can jam them at the line. And if there are jump balls in the end zone, that sort of thing, Dre probably has the upper hand on some things against Brown. So I think he might come close, maybe that 80-yard-ish range, but I don't know that he gets 100. Williams had a pretty good game against the Bengals last year, if I remember correctly, at least one good game, and he looked great this last week as well. I don't think he'll run all over the Bengals defense as we saw him do against the Redskins on Monday night. But the Bengals running defense did not play well against the Jets, against Forte and company there. So I'm going to say he may go over 100 and Brown under.
Initially I wanted to agree with AC and take the Williams under, or Williams over Brown under, but now I think I'm going to go with Scott here. I think that if it was 100 cumulative, or I should say collective rushing and receiving yards from Williams, I'd go over easy, but I like the point Scott made. The Steelers seem to like to give their running backs a couple of breaks throughout the game, even if they're healthy. And I just think that Williams is probably going to catch a couple of short routes or screens or whatever and take them for a long distance. But I don't think all 100 yards are going to – I think he's going to get 100 yards. I don't think they're all going to be rushing. So I'll take the over-under that, whatever you want to call it. With AB, I'm going to take the under as well. I think you guys both made great points. With Dre Kirkpatrick, like AC said, he's got that length. He's pretty quick. I think people underestimate his recovery speed. He's really quick to recover if he gets beat. And I also think the absence of Martavis Bryant, I should have really grilled Chris harder on this, because the Bengals, when the the Jets had Marshall and Decker, who people are saying is the best 1-2 receiving duo in the NFL. 15 targets, 5 catches. I think it was 69 yards and a TD. And the TD was on a ball that Drake Kirkpatrick just really couldn't get his hand on. But Eric Decker came down with it, and that's the way it was. But as you guys mentioned, the Bengals defense has done a really good job containing Antonio Brown. Without Martavis Bryant in the picture, one guy to shut down. I know Eli Rogers has been promising, but we have, the Bengals have Carlos Dansby. He plays well inside. I think he'll play pretty good coverage against the slot. He made a ton of tackles last game. And you have Iloka, who's an enforcer in both the pass and the run game. I think he's a guy who really, if he can Eli Rogers and send an enforcing hit his way, he could. I mean, I'm not encouraging injury or hoping that he gets hurt, but I think Iloka is one of those guys where his hits are hard, and he could maybe ding Eli Rogers up a little bit if he even touches him. So I don't know. I just think that the lack of support, it's so funny because we talked about the lack of supporting cast around the Bengals receivers all offseason long, but even with a healthy Marcus Wheaton, Wheaton's such an inconsistent receiver, and Darius Hayward-Bay can stretch the field, but behind Antonio Brown, you really don't have a lot to be super excited about. And with 2 corners who had such a great game against the Jets, I think that it's just one of those things where the Bengals are going to get the best of Antonio Brown, and maybe he scores 1 or 2 times, but I don't think they're going to be surrendering any big plays on the field. I think that the Steelers, if they're smart, are going to try to get DeAngelo Williams the ball in space, whether via short passes, and Antonio Brown the ball in space. But I think the most effective way they're going to be able to do that is match up Williams against the linebackers and try to get him the ball in space, like the Jets kind of did with Forte.
Well, that is the over-under segment with Connor Howe. Good stuff. One thing, and we're going to talk about a little bit about the preview of this game, aside from our interview with Chris, but one thing that's going to be interesting to see is the safety play of both teams, given the high-powered receivers that both teams employ in A.J. Green and Antonio Brown. But good stuff, Connor. That's the over-under segment. We started it last week and doing it again. So it's a fun little game, and maybe this time we'll keep a little closer track on our scores here based on how we did, and we can grade ourselves next week. But good stuff, Connor. Appreciate it. One other segment we have done throughout most of the history of this show. And by the way, if you haven't been able to, please download the show on iTunes. It's available there. It'll be up on Cincy Jungle's website. You can stream it through the site. It's on SoundCloud. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel to see the videos of the podcast. So we do the podcast in its entirety, as well as other little segments that we put out in this show. So download those, check those out, and we appreciate feedback, all of your support. Definitely appreciate that with the Orange and Black Insider. But another segment that we've been doing a lot in the history of this show is the Hater of the Week. And usually what we've done is we've pointed out a media member or something of that nature where that said media member kind of slights the Bengals for a variety of reasons, whether it's founded or unfounded. And we've kind of done that, especially as the regular season began. But now that we're entering Steelers week, I'm going to do a little different spin on it. I want to ask you guys, and I asked Chris a similar question earlier, but who do you feel is the most hated Steelers player currently on the roster that according to Bengals fans? Who do you think that Bengals fans despise the most that's currently on the Steelers roster? Connor, I'll let you go first.
I think the obvious answer is Ben Roethlisberger. I think fans really don't like him. And as Chris kind of pointed out earlier with Adam Jones's off-field stuff, Ben Roethlisberger doesn't have the greatest track record off the field. That being said, if we're going to go personal vendetta, I really don't like Vince Williams. He's a guy who, just his Twitter makes me want to throw a brick at a wall or something. I mean, he's threatening to kill Vontaze Burfict. I know it's kind of like a joke, but it's still being super childish on Twitter. And I know Marquise Flowers on the Bengals was kind of the same way. Not to the same extent that Williams was, but the whole Harambe thing happened, and I'm not in the whole R.I.P. Harambe. Like, let's make it. It just kind of was a meme to me, but even to just say that before the whole Harambe death blew up, to be like, oh, well, he's gone from a better place, basically just taking shots at the city of Cincinnati as a whole, kind of for no reason, unprovoked. I really didn't like that. But I think if you're going to go fans, Ben Roethlisberger is one of those guys where you can't really go wrong. People really don't like him in Cincinnati, from my perspective.
It's a good call, but at the same time, I do think there is I don't want to say – I hesitate to use the word respect, but I mean, I think fans realize that he is a very, very good player. He'll probably be in the Hall of Fame, and he's done a lot of good things. So I think there's a little bit of an envious respect, I guess, if you will, since he's won Super Bowls. But yes, he's not the most likable guy. Scott, who do you have on your radar as a Bengals fan and someone who covers the Bengals? Who do you have on your radar as a guy that just really gets under your skin, who's a Steelers player?
It's interesting you mentioned the respect of someone you hate, and if we were looking at old players, I think Hines Ward would definitely take that too, as someone who, yeah, he was a great player, but man, I hate that guy. Anyway, looking at current players, one that I'd have a hard time avoiding is Ryan Shazier because of that hit on Giovanni Bernard in the playoff game, and since it wasn't even penalized, he kind of led with the helmet, lowered the helmet, everything that, if Burfict did that, he would have been flagged, kicked out of the game, suspended. Like Shazier, kind of spears him with the helmet, causes a fumble, should have been flagged, and that, one turnover was the difference. So that, I think, is
logo.
Yeah, and that's one
on the ground
that I would say, but I don't think a lot of Bengals fans would say him. And the only reason I say that is if you look at the population of Bengals fans, and we had this wonderful thing on our Cincy Jungle website this summer where people kind of picked on a map where they were from, and we're kind of spread everywhere, but a lot of the local fans, if you look at a map of Ohio and the surrounding, the tri-state area, everything inside the 275 interstate loop around Cincinnati is one thing. Every fan outside of that, so kind of north, the rest of Ohio, generally love Ohio State, and Shazier's from Ohio State, so you're going to be really hard pressed to find a Bengals fan north of 275 who would be willing to say Shazier just because he was a Buckeye. So I'm going to eliminate him as much as I want to include him, and I'm going to say Mike Mitchell. I'm going to go with the headhunter, the guy who seems to have it after. It just seems like he has one. He's kind of like the goon in hockey. Your one mission, Tomlin pride tells me, your one mission is to do whatever you can do to either concuss AJ Green or Tyler Eifert or whoever seems to be their best player. Go do it. So that's a guy I can't stand, because it's not like it's just one occasion. It's not like it was just a one-time thing, but it just seems like every single time he just, if he sees the black and orange Bengal striped helmet, he just zeroes in on it. So for that reason, I'm going to say Mike.
Ankles in the Chiefs game, either last year or the year before, with all the Bengal fans that are like, oh, Vontaze Burfict twists ankles. I mean, Mike Mitchell twists ankles too.
Yeah, and I mean, that's Scott. That's the guy. When Chris asked me that question on his own podcast, that's the guy I chose, Mike Mitchell. And it's kind of funny because he hasn't been in Pittsburgh all that long, 2 or 3 years, but you've seen him headhunt AJ Green, you've seen him headhunt Marvin Jones, and stand over them, jawing at them. He's not a very likable guy, even though he's been there a short amount of time. So since you took my answer, Scott, I'm going to kind of cop out here a little bit. I will say Mitchell's probably on my list. Shazier is on my list. A guy actually also, Antoine Blake, who was celebrating with Shazier when Giovanni Bernard went down with that concussion in the playoff game. That's another guy I'm starting to dislike a lot. But I'm gonna cop out a little bit.
Tennessee now, though.
What's that?
He's in Tennessee now, though, so Bengals are fortunate there.
Okay, there you go. Good call. So that being said, I'm going to cop out here, and I'm going to say a former player and current coach, and I'm going to say Joey Porter. And I think, and I'm only saying that, Scott, because you took my Mike Mitchell glory there, but I let you go.
I did leave you Tomlin.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. So I'm going to say Joey.
I like the Munchak too.
Yeah, I mean, we could go on for days about the coaches there, but based on his history as a player, if you're old enough to remember what he did with Levi Jones in Las Vegas years ago, he was always jawing at the Bengals, and he and Ocho Cinco used to get into it in pregame stuff all the time. And then you saw what he did in the wild card game, and he basically relatively went unpunished, and the Bengals got double punished on a single play based on him illegally being on the field and goading Bengals players into a penalty there. So I'm gonna say Mitchell is my guy, but if I'm gonna cop out and be a little different from you guys, I'm gonna say Joey Porter. So that's our Hater of the Week segment with a little bit of a twist. In that we look at the most hated Steelers players as we go into week 2, and the Bengals are heading to Pittsburgh to face the Steelers, a battle of 1-0 teams, and a critical game in the AFC and the AFC North. The Bengals have a rough first stretch of games. First two games are on the road against teams that the Jets didn't make the playoffs last year, but they won 10 games. The Bengals took care of business there. They now head to Pittsburgh. Connor, we're going to just kind of briefly touch on the game here. Who needs to step up for the Bengals in order for them to win, whether it's a starter or role player, maybe someone who played well last week, maybe someone who didn't? And what do you see in terms of score and how this game playing out?
I think that on offense, the one guy you got to look out for is Jeremy Hill. Like I was kind of alluding to earlier, he's one of those players where, the Steelers, they lost Steve McClendon, who was dominant against the Bengals last week, as more of a pass rusher than a run defender for the Jets. But their nose tackle now is either going to be Daniel McCullers, who obviously people are going to be hyped about in Pittsburgh because he's 6'7", he's tall, he has that size that people like, but he's still a very unproven player. Or it's going to be their third, I believe, round pick, Javon Hargrave, who I think you really liked, AC, and a lot of people liked in the draft process this year. That being said, that's going to be a first or second year player starting at nose tackle, going up against a running back who was a year removed from being the best running back in the NFL during the second half of the 2014 season, as well as a guy who has looked great throughout the preseason and looked pretty decent last week in week 1. So I think Jeremy Hill is one of those guys where you got to get him going. And obviously, I hope that he doesn't even have to touch the ball, because I hope AJ Green just torches right by the Steelers secondary for the entire game, and the Bengals only have to touch the ball in the run game. But Jeremy Hill with that desire to get vengeance, maybe against Pittsburgh, that's something that I would definitely keep an eye out for. And I'm going to go on defense. I don't know. I'm just going to say the linebacking position as a whole, because obviously we all know the defensive line needs to play well. They need to play well every single game. That's kind of a given. But when you're facing D'Angelo Williams, who's coming off 143, as well as just a run defense without Vontaze Burfict, you really need the linebackers to step up. And we saw last week, Carlos Dansby played every single snap of the entire game. He had a ton of tackles. He wasn't perfect, but he was a lot better than Emmanuel Lemur ever really was. And Ray Maluga, I think, played less than 10 snaps because the Bengals were pretty much just a nickel for the entire game. So I think the Jets are probably going to try to force the Bengals' hand, I would guess. Probably try to force them into nickel packages. And that being said, you got to go Dansby and Maluga as those guys, as well as Ray. I mean, they need to step up in coverage. They need to make plays the run game. The linebackers are kind of the X factor, I think, on defense.
Okay, so you gave us a handful there. What about score?
Score, I'm going to go, I believe I said 24-20 Bengals. I don't think it's going to be a super high scoring game. Don't think it's going to be super low scoring. I think it'll be right down the middle.
Okay. Yeah, and these matchups, it's really weird because some of them are these high-scoring affairs. But then you look back to the Bengals win last year in Pittsburgh, and I think the end score there was like 13-7 or something very low scoring and obviously defensive oriented there. So, Scott, just a couple of players you're looking at to step up, that the Bengals need to step up in order to win in Pittsburgh, and your score prediction for this week.
I'm going to say, as far as offensive side, I'm going to go with AJ Green, who obviously stepped up in week 1 and is not a surprise, but I think someone who we definitely need to win. If you look at the game that we won in Pittsburgh last year, it was basically Dalton and Green. I mean, 17 targets, 11 catches, 100-some yards. I mean, he was the whole entire offense, more or less. So I'm going to say for us to win, we really need something big from him, which I think we're going to get, especially since we're still kind of feeling out who our number 2 and number 3 are as far as the targets. So I'm picturing Dalton going heavy with Green, and if Green can abuse that secondary and get a bunch of yards, I'd say offensively, that's probably one of the keys. Defensively, I'm going to say it's that the front 4, especially Atkins and Dunlap are the guys I'm looking for, because I still think this team is kind of built on being able to control the ball, being able to control the clock. As Connor was saying with Jeremy Hill running the ball, that's I think what I would love to do. And to do that, you can't get behind. You have to have those guys up front really playing like the guys that we expect them to be. We expect Atkins to be blowing up DeCastro and kind of forcing double teams. We expect Dunlap to be really chasing after Ben Roethlisberger. So I think defensively, that's what I'm really looking forward to seeing is, is that defensive line going to be able to be the defensive line that we kind of hope it is, and we expected last year. I mean, they had a ton of sacks last year, and after week 1, they really didn't seem to show it. So I'm kind of hoping that, defensively, that's what I want to see is can that front 4, and then when they pull Dunlap in and put Hunt in, how does he look against a different right tackle? Because going in the Jets game, that was one of their weaknesses, was the right tackle was kind of new. They've talked about how they're going to rotate him. They don't know who's going to play. And he looked pretty good. But, okay, that was the Jets right tackle. How do you look against another guy? Was that a fluke, or has he turned the corner and has he become an American football player? So, I'd say A.J. Green and defensive line are going to be my 2. As far as the score, I'm going to go with something just kind of off the wall. You mentioned the low scoring. I think last year, 2 of the scores were like 16-10, 16-18. I know earlier in the podcast, Chris was saying he was expecting a higher score. I'm going to say it's probably lower scoring, probably some interceptions, just some, very defensive, tough, hard to get yards kind of games. So I'm going to go and say that we tie 17-17. Just because Marvin Lewis has a tendency to tie.
Boldest prediction of all time.
The Eagles, the Panthers, we just seem to tie people, and I'm just not convinced that Nugent is going to be able to hit that game-winning field goal in overtime. And that field sucks. I mean, Heinz Field.
Oh, it's terrible.
Trying to kick in Heinz Field, so you basically have to score a touchdown in overtime to win. So, or else get within like 20 yards. So I'm going to say something screwy like that. There might be some chippiness, some penalties maybe early on that kind of keeps the teams from really getting any momentum. We go to overtime, no one can hit a field goal because they're kicking up sod and not the football, and we tie 17-17.
I like it. That's I would prefer a win, but yeah, I mean, it's
yeah, me too.
That's that interesting point though, Scott. The extra points will probably be in bigger focus this game just because of the condition of the field and the extension of the length of extra points the kickers have to hit now with the rule change. But good stuff from both you guys. I'm going to say the 2 guys I would like to see step up this week. I'm going to say Tyler Boyd. He showed some nice things last Sunday, but only finished with 24 yards. He did force a pass interference penalty that led to Bengals points, which was good to see. But, I think you still don't know week to week what LaFell's going to bring you, especially as he's still dealing with that hand injury. Was last week an anomaly, or is it, hey, LaFell's going back to who he was in his first year with New England and can be a good contributor and a good complementary piece to A.J. Green. You just don't know quite yet because week 1 is always weird. I think just given some of the secondary issues with Pittsburgh, I think Tyler Boyd just working out of the slot and doing some things on the outside is going to be someone to watch, especially as he comes back to Pittsburgh where he played college ball. He'll probably have some family, friends, all that kind of stuff there. So he's a guy to watch. The other guy I want to see end up playing better, he did not play that well, in my opinion, on Sunday against the Jets, and he has big shoes to fill, especially when it's the Bengals going up against the Steelers, and that's Sean Williams. Reggie Nelson, he's replacing Reggie Nelson, who was a Ben Roethlisberger killer, especially over the last few years. Reggie always seemed to step up with a critical interception against Pittsburgh, especially in Pittsburgh. Sean Williams was out of position quite a few times. He missed a tackle or two against the Jets, and he is starting for the first time. He had a great interception to basically seal the win for the Bengals in Pittsburgh last year. But that was kind of as a role player and a rotational guy. So he needs to really play well, especially with Antonio Brown there. And he needs to really jive well with the rest of the defense. So I'm looking at Tyler Boyd and Sean Williams this week. Who are you looking at? You can let us know on Twitter at BengalsOBI. This podcast will be up on Cincy Jungle. You can leave some of that stuff in the comments there. Leave comments on our YouTube channel, The Orange and Black Insider on YouTube. And you can find us on SoundCloud, the audio portions of this show. You can find it there, and you can download the show on iTunes and check us out there. Leave a rating, all that good stuff. We appreciate it. Our thanks, that's going to wrap it up for us. So our thanks to Chris Bradford of the Beaver County Times. He gave us some great insight from the Steelers' perspective. You can find him on Twitter at BCT Bradford, and he's got stuff up on his own podcast as well as some of the things he's doing for his site and all that good stuff. So check his stuff out. We greatly appreciate his time. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me. I know there were a couple little things we were dealing with early on, and I appreciate you coming on and all the insight that you provide.
Thanks as always, AC.
Thanks, and I'm hoping by this time next week we have a kick return that at least went 20 yards.
Ooh, good point.
That would be nice, especially when you're seeing Adam Jones take most of them. That was a little surprising. So let's hope for a Bengals win. It's Steelers week. Obviously, emotions are high. Excitement's high because the Bengals put out an exciting win against a good team last week. So let's hope the Bengals get that critical win in Pittsburgh, start off 2-0 as they head back home in week 3 to take on the Broncos. For the Orange and Black Insider, I'm Anthony Cosenza. For Scott Schultze and Connor Howe, Hoo day.
Hoo day.
Hoo day.